welcome to my channel. I am Andrea and this is Beyond the Pink Door, and today's video I am going to show you how to make the brand new pattern from Atelier Jupe, which is the Julia sweater. So here it is. I feel engulfed in coziness in this. So I'll tell you about the Julia sweater. So as you can see, it is a cozy sweatshirt. It's got a snap fastener band down the front here. It's got very clever pockets. They are really cozy. It's got elastic at the bottom of the sweater and it's got elastic on the end of the sleeve. Now I quite like to turn the elastic up and then it just feels like really nice with a pair of jeans. So I've made mine in this lovely boucle fabric, so super cozy, and I've added a cotton canvas piece here for the placket, and I've attached some snap fasteners. Now you don't have to use a contrasting fabric, you can use the boucle itself, but I just think it's a really nice feature, and yeah, I think it looks really nice. If you did use the boucle, you'd be like super extra cozy, I think, on it. I love the seam lines on it, so you can see there's some seams down the front here, and there's also this really clever construction. So we've got one panel here, another here, and on this side panel, part of the pocket is part of the pattern piece, and then this panel down here, the other part of the pocket is part of its piece. So really unusual looking pattern pieces. The back is all in the one piece, and the sleeves are really handy because they've just got elastic on the end. Now if you didn't like the elastic, you could leave it without the elastic on the end either. That would be really nice, but I have to say, for the cold weather, I think the elastic is going to keep me really lovely and snuggly. You can make this in lots of different fabrics, so you could make it in fleece, sweatshirting, you can also make it in like teddy, in coating fabrics. It does need to have a little bit of stretch, however I don't feel it needs to have like very stretchy fabric. It would also be lovely in the cable knits, in jacquards, in sweater knits. Yeah, loads of different options. In terms of sizing, I made my normal size, which is a size 38, and it just feels perfect. I'm only wearing a t-shirt underneath today, but I feel I could, if I wanted to, I could wear like a light sweater underneath it. So you could wear it as like a jacket or instead of a coat if you wanted, or just wear it as I am with a t-shirt or a vest top underneath. I think it's really versatile as well in terms of you could have a great bit of fun doing some like colour blocking, so you could change some of these, because we all have a lot of, like, I know I certainly do, have lots of different sweatshirting left in my stash, so where I've cut out different sweaters, say like the Charlie sweater here, and I always end up with like a little square of fabric left over. It's just too pretty to... I'm not going to put it in the bin, I'm going to keep it for one of those projects, and maybe this could be one of those projects where you could use it on some of the panels. So yeah, very versatile wear, really fun to make. So yeah, we'll crack on with the video, and I hope you enjoy it. Any questions, pop them into the comments or drop me an email at hello@beyondthepinkdoor.com. So today I am going to make the Atelier Jupe Julia sweater. So this is a really cozy looking sweater. It is made from a fluffy fabric or a sweatshirting. I'm going to make mine today in a boucle. You could make it in a teddy, you could make it in a fleece. It's got an optional contrasting woven fabric up the centre here with snap fasteners in it. It's got two pockets here. It's got elastic through the hem and elastic through the cuff, so it's very clever. So we have our finish measurements here. I measure as a 38 and I'm happy with the finish measurements of the 38, so I'm going for a straight 38. We have our supplies list here, which is fabric. I have my boucle. We have a matching thread. There we go. I have some iron-on interfacing. I'm using the G710. We have an optional contrasting fabric, so I have this cotton canvas, press stud buttons. We have two types of elastic, so it's asking for a 2 centimeter elastic and a 4 centimeter. Now, I've got a 4 centimeter elastic here, and what I can do with this is I can actually cut it up the middle and make it into 2 centimeters. So I've tried it out, I've trimmed up the middle, and it's not fraying or anything. So it's one of those elastics that has all the little ridges on it. So you can see there, so I've basically cut up the middle, so that's really, really handy. So it is suggesting here that you can use sweater fabrics, teddy, quilted, wool mix fabrics. We have a fabric layout sheet, and we also have, so this is quite different to your normal patterns, but normal for Atelier Jupe patterns. So our pattern sheet won't have any of this information on it, and what I like to do is write all of this onto my pattern sheet. So we have pattern piece number 1 is the front middle. It's telling us that the seam allowance is 1.5 all around. We have a side front, we're cutting 2 of those, again 1.5 centimeter. We have the front bottom, it's cut on a fold. It is 1.5 centimeters around, and then on the hem it's 5 centimeters. That's where we're threading our elastic. The back we're cutting on the fold, again, same seam allowances. Button placket, which is our contrasting fabric, we're cutting 2 of them. We've 1.5 centimeters, and we're going to interface that as well. Number 6 is our collar. We're cutting 2 on the fold. Again, same seam allowance, and we're just interfacing 1 of those. Number 7 is the sleeve, 1.5 centimeters, and then 4 for the hem, and that's where we're putting the 2 centimeter elastic. And then after that we have our fabric layout. So depending on what size you are making, what layout you're going to use, obviously I'm going to use the middle one. Just to point out actually that the contrasting fabric piece of fabric is in here as well, so just to keep that out separately if you're using contrasting. And then after that we have our instructions. So I've cut out all of my pattern pieces and I've labelled them. So this is obviously my sleeve. I have, let me see, okay, I've got my back. So this little sign here is to cut on the fold basically. So I've written back, cut on the fold. This is my collar, so I'm going to cut 2, but I'm only interfacing 1. This is my button placket. Again, I'm cutting 2 and interfacing them. Then these are my front pieces. So this is my side front. This is my centre front. So I was just lining them up to see how it all goes together because I like doing that. So that goes there. And then we've got this strange piece here, which includes the pocket. So I am figuring that I'm just going to fold over the seam allowance here. And that fits in here, so it's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle. So this then makes the pocket in here. So that's really interesting. I always like to do that when I'm making something new, so I kind of get a bit of an idea of how it all goes together. And then our button placket goes here in the middle and it goes up onto the collar. So that's how that all works. So I have all my pattern pieces laid out. I've more or less gone with the pattern layout. So I've got my back there against the fold, I've got the lower front against the fold, I've got a collar here. When I cut that out, I'll cut the next collar beside it. I've got my front pieces here. I've made sure they're all on the grain line, so it would be very easy to put this kind of at an angle, but I've made sure it's on grain line. here's my sleeve. I have a funny feeling my sleeve is probably going to be too long, but I haven't made this before. So if it is too long, I'll just shorten it here at the bottom. But you do have a shortening line here, so we'll see how that goes. And then I've got my contrasting button placket here on my cotton. So I'm going to go ahead and cut out all of those pieces now. Okay, so we've got everything cut out and I've got my relevant pieces interfaced. So here's my button placket, both pieces interfaced, and I've also taken care to notch the important parts. So I've got 3 notches here, I've got 1 notch at the top, and I've got 2 notches here at the side. So these are showing us, I am imagining, the intersection between the front and the collar. I have my collar piece interfaced. That interfaced absolutely fine. I didn't hold the iron on it for too long because I didn't want to squish the little bobbles. We've got a notch down the bottom here, which is going to show us where it attaches in line with the shoulder seam. So that's that. We've got our sleeve here, we've got our notch here to show us where it attaches at the front armhole, and we've got 2 notches here for the back. This is our back piece, and we've got our 2 notches here. Our centre front, no notches. Our lower front, we've got a notch here at the side, so I've done that. And I think that's it. So we're all basically ready to go. So I have read through the instructions, and I've also had a look at the Atelier Jupe tutorial, which is on their website, which is very, very handy. So we're going to start with the side front. I always have a quick glance again, just in case I've missed any notches. And I always leave my pattern pieces on until I need them. And again, that is to just be able to know what they are, basically, and to check in case I've missed any notches again. So we're going to grab one, and we're going to get the centre front that matches it. I'm going to pin these 2 together, and we're going to sew at our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So I always like to point out that when we're putting on a sloped 2 pieces of what you call them, diagonal seams, that where they meet up here, you can always see this little triangle sticking out. So if you try to match them up so that they are in line, it's going to throw everything else out. So basically we're going to start sewing here and sew all the way down to the end on both pieces. I am going to overlock each piece as well as I go. If you don't have an overlocker, it's not 100% necessary. This kind of fabric, and most types of like fleeces and sweatshirt fabrics, they are not going to fray, but I just like the look of it inside when it's overlocked. I'm going to see as well if I want to press the seams over to one side. I will try one piece and see how it goes. I do like to press as I go, just see how the boucle works. So here we go to the sewing machine to sew our 2 seams. So here we are at the sewing machine. I've actually put in a brand new needle, I've threaded up my machine, I've put in a stretch needle because there's a little bit of stretch in this fabric. I'm not using Maraflex thread. I've checked where my line for my 1.5 centimetre seam allowance is here. I tend to jump between 2 different sewing machines, so I always like to double check. I'm going to set my stitch length a little bit longer than when I would maybe sew a woven fabric. So I'm going to a 3 here. My machine defaults to 2.5, so just a little bit longer. Start with my back stitch and then sew all the way down. I think I'm actually going to go to 3.5. And there we go, and I'm going to do the same with the other one. So here's my 2 seams. I've actually pressed them to one side. They pressed no problem. I don't know really what I was worrying about. I just gave them lots of steam. So the boucle is 100% polyester, so don't worry if it changes colour for an instant, it pops back to the right colour again. So I'm really happy about that because I do love to press as I go. So then we're going to grab our back piece and we're going to pin the front pieces to the back at the shoulders. So you'll notice that I put the back down first and then I put the front on top, and that's because I want to make sure that when I'm sewing that this seam here doesn't get pushed over or anything, which is really easy to happen. So I'm pinning together, and we have the same scenario here again. So if we pin so that our edges are even, then there's a little bit of a gap here, so we want to push that over ever so slightly so that when we sew right to the end we have the 2 pieces together and there's no little gap. And I'm going to put one here in our seam. And we're going to do the same for the other side. Make sure that it is your shoulder seam and not the end. Very easy to get these weird shapes mixed up. So I'm going to bring them to the sewing machine and sew across as well. So here we are, another straightforward seam. So in order to get your seam to stay the right direction, I tend to use either a stitch ripper or an awl or whatever comes to hand, and I'll just push the seam down and make sure it doesn't twist when it's going under the foot. Now you make sure obviously to pull it out in time so it doesn't get caught under the foot. Back stitch there, and just to save taking that out from under the foot of the machine, I'm going to offer up the other shoulder seam right in front so it can just travel on. This seam isn't so bad because obviously it's just going to run under the foot. So I'm not even going to snip them apart, I'm going to use them just like that under the overlocker as well. Now you can see here just where my 2 seams link together, and I'll just trim them apart now. There we go. In a minute now I will press those seams to the back. But what I'm going to sew next are the collars. So Normally we would sew the 3 sides of the collar, but for this we're just sewing the top together. So this is our outside one because it's interfaced, and here's our inside one. So we're going to pin these along, and we are going to sew that seam across. So we're going to sew together the top of the collar, the top edge of the collar. So here's our collar with our seam here. So I'm going to press under a 1 centimetre seam allowance along the raw edge here of the under collar. So the interfaced one is the outer collar. So this obviously isn't going to press very crisply, but it should, yeah, it is staying in place, that's okay. So I'm kind of stepping the iron across it, and then I'm going to press the seam we've just sewn towards the inner collar. I'll give it some steam. Okay. Now I'm just checking that I still have my notches here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Grabbing our body piece again. So here's our neckline, and we're going to pin our collar in place. First thing is I'm going to get my notched piece, and I'm going to pin that to the shoulder seam. I'm going to get my other one and pin. I'm going to make sure that my shoulder seam goes towards the back. I'm going to put another pin here in the middle of the back. Now, because the collar is interfaced and the fabric isn't, try not to handle too much. So I'm supporting it on the table. I'm not dragging it because I don't want to misshapen the neckline and stretch it. And now we're going to sew that seam. So starting at one end, going to just make sure, here's my shoulder seam, that it's going towards the back. So what we want to do is sew this without having any puckers through the main part of the body. I'll possibly cut my notch a little bit too generously there. And here where my shoulder is again, I want to shove that in towards the back. Now I can feel it moving there, so I'm going to force it in. see there, as I say, my notches might have been a little bit too generous, but I've made sure that they're in the seam allowance. So I've just pressed my seam up into my collar, and I'm going to pop that over there to one side, and I'm going to grab my contrasting button plackets. So if you remember, we put in some notches, so on one part we put a notch in the centre, and then we had a notch a little bit further down. So this is our top part of the button placket. This is the part that joins into the middle. So we're going to sew this seam here, so we're going to fold it at that notch. And we're very simply going to sew across. So just making sure that you've got the right end. And we're very simply going to sew across, backstitch. Beginning and the end, and again, I'm not going to take that one out, I'm just going to put this one straight in underneath, making sure not to sew one on top of the other, of course. And then we can just snip between the two. So here are our two pieces. So I'm just going to push that in so I get a nice corner. And then I'm going to press down the centre of both, so keeping the raw edges together. Then I have our notch here showing us the centre. Okay, so we're going to grab our front again. So we have our inner collar, our outer collar. We've got our little centre front piece. And what we're going to do is we're going to pin this in place through one layer. So we're going to match up the seam up here at the top. I'm going to separate them there. And I'm going to put a pin right through the two centres. Now we have a notch here for this seam. So we have this seam pushed into the collar. Match up that notch. And then we're going to pin the rest down to the end. So keeping the edges together, the raw edges even. And then what we're going to do is we have our notch here, and we have our fold here, if you remember. We're going to match up that notch to our folded up 1 centimetre. I think I'm going to leave it back, but put the notch at the fold line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from where the pin is, so leaving this loose, and I'm going to sew across here through this seam, and you can see there I have pushed one seam one way, the other, so it reduces the bulk, right across this and down to the end. Now, so you can see where my pin is there, you can see where my notch is, so I'm going to start my seam in line with that notch, 1.5 centimetres in. Okay, hopefully you can see that there. I take my pin out. I'm going to make sure that my seams end up going in the direction that I want. Okay, get a bit closer. I want to make sure that this seam stays up into the collar as well. And then it's straight down. And all that is while you're checking that you are using the crest seam allowance. So this is how it looks. So we have our seams. That one bunched up a little bit there, so I'm going to unpick that and sew that little piece again. I'm going to do the other side, and I think I'm going to film it again just in case you couldn't quite see on the other side, because just sometimes it's just not quite easy to see exactly what's going on. The only difference I've done this time is this is the under collar, and I've actually folded up the seam allowance. So the last time I left it open, which was of no great advantage. So I'm starting from the bottom this time. Now this is the seam that went in the wrong direction the last time, so I'm going to make sure that goes up into the collar this time. This is far easier to do when you're not trying to film it. So here we go. And again, here's the two seams that I want to keep separated in different directions. Now I'm opening it up quite a bit just so that you can see on the camera. There you go. So let's see how they went this time. Okay, so there's the seam allowance. There's the two seams. Okay, that's gone in the right direction this time. Okay, so we'll go to the ironing board and do a little bit of pressing now. So that's what it looks like on the inside. So there's our button placket. And there's our collar. So this is how it looks. I'm going to trim back this fabric here, not the cotton fabric, but just the fleece fabric. So I'm going to trim it back to half of its seam allowance, just so it won't be so bulky around the top here, so being careful. I've got my finger put in between the seam there, or you can push it back like that and cut. I'm just going to trim it back as far as there. So I'm going to press this seam here into the button placket. And I've already just pressed in the seam allowance here of the button placket. And I'm going to press this seam up again. Now I'm just shoving the seam in there into the button placket. And I'm going to match up this intersection here. So you can see where all this joins here. And I'm going to pop a pin in there. And then I'm going to pin the pressed edge just kind of roll that into place. And then on the outside, I may move the pins actually to the outside. I'm going to stitch in the ditch here all the way down, and that's going to secure the button placket into place. And I'm going to do that on the two sides. Okay, trim off the threads and have a look at the back, and there it is, it's all held in place, but you don't see the stitching on the outside. I really like that look, and I've done that on the other side as well. So this is how we're looking. Button plackets, 2 layers of our collar. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pin the folded up edge of the collar down to the stitching. So we have our little notch there again, first one to pin down. Seek out our other notch and pin that. And then I'm going to put another couple of pins in all along, making sure that the edge of the collar stays up here, that it doesn't roll too much to the inside, which is very easy to happen. I'm going to pop another pin there. I just seem to have left them all at the sewing machine. and then we'll go back to the sewing machine and we'll stitch that down. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here at the edge. We're going to top stitch the collar down. I'm going to keep my folded edge here very close on top of my stitching line. I'm going to try and stitch close to the edge. Making sure that the layers stay nice and flat. There is some writing on the inside of my fabric. This is just something that happens at the beginning of some rolls. It's done by the manufacturer. It doesn't bleed to the outside, so I'm not too bothered. I'm a bit annoyed with myself that I didn't see it, but just making sure it all goes into the collar. Trim that off. That looks okay on the outside. So here's our two fronts. So we're going to position our right over our left, matching up our marks, and we're basically going to stitch through all the layers there. So I'm going to do that now in a tick. So here's the front with the layers sewn together. I've popped a few pins just along the button placket just to hold it together for handiness. I've got my lower front piece here, and we have a couple of marks that we need to make on it. So you'll notice on your pattern piece you have these squares. So I'm going to line up my pattern piece again, and I'm going to pop some pins through the centre of those squares. Now I'm just using a permanent marker for the purpose of the sew along so that we can easily see the marks. I'm pulling my fabric and my pattern back, just one layer of fabric and pattern back, and then I'm going to make some marks on the fabric where the pins come out. So you'll see them there. And then what we're going to do is put our front down flat and get our piece like so. We're matching up the edges of, this is our pocket basically. And then what we're going to do is we are going to sew through these marks. So we're going to sew from this mark into the corner here, and then on up here. This mark here on the corner is going to match up with our seam underneath. So we're only going to sew as far as that dot. We're going to sew through this dot and as far as this dot. So that's all we're going to sew for the moment, is from this corner here to this dot, and from this dot through that dot to the next dot here, and we're going to make sure that this dot is over the intersection of that seam. Okay, so I'm starting at this dot here. Through the next dot. And then down here to this dot. And then on the other side. So I've done the other side already. And then we've got this seam here in the middle. So just checking that my seams stayed in the right direction. And now we're going to sew across here. So I'm going to put a couple of pins in here. And we're going to sew this last little gap. So from this seam right across to this seam. So starting where the other seam ends. Now we'll go back to the iron and see how that looks. Now here's how it looks on the inside. So here's the lower part. And here's how it looks on the outside. So you can see how the pockets are formulating. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to sew two sides of the pocket. So I've popped in a few pins. We're going to start at our dot here, and we're going to sew down to the corner here, and then across here on both pockets. So here's our dot. So start at our dot. Go another stitch. This is how it looks from the inside now. So I've overlocked the seams, I've trimmed off threads, missed another one there, and I have put some pins through the pocket there at the side seam. This is how it looks on the front. So here we have, we can put our hands in our pockets. The next thing I'm going to do is put the sleeves in. So I'll make sure that my shoulder seam goes to the back. I'm just going to grab my sleeve. Now I want this sleeve because here's my 2 notches. I'm going to find my 2 notches here at the back. Yeah, there they are, hard enough to see them in the fabric. And then we're going to find the one. I'm going to turn it the other way around because I prefer to sew the sleeve to the body rather than the body to the sleeve. Here's our notch again. Pin in there. Then I'm going to pin all the rest of it in place, matching my raw edges together. Now I should have a notch at the top as well that matches the shoulder seam. And we're going to sew that seam on both sleeves. Now time to sew the sleeve seam, which is quite straightforward if you've made any sort of t-shirts or sweatshirts before. I like to sew the seam in flat like this so that I can get in and press it to one side. Especially on bulky fabric like this, it's difficult to press it if you set in the sleeve. So when it's sewn flat like this, it's very easy to get the iron in. I'm making sure to keep my shoulder seam to one side. Keeping an eye on my seam allowance mark as well. And also, while I'm here, I'm going to stitch the pocket here onto the side seam. So I'm going to stay halfway into my seam allowance. And just stitching it in place because it'll make it easier then for the next seam. Just going through the 3 layers. Oh, there we go. Now I've just pressed the seam flat and I've pressed it up into the garment, so there's my sleeve and it's just pressed it into the sweater. Next thing for us to do is to do the side seams and the sleeve. So I remembered that we had a notch here in the back. pin in here. And what I'm going to do under the sleeve is, even though I've pressed the seams in two different directions, and then what I'm going to do here under the arms is, even though I have pressed the seam up, I'm actually going to separate them into two different directions, just so it's not as bulky. So I'm putting a pin there in between them. And then I'm going to pin down along my sleeve. I try to always use the pins with the little bobbly tops on them when I'm sewing something like these boucles and cozy fabrics, because the ones without the tops can easily get lost in the fabric, and that's when you can have a little accident with your overlocker. So I'm going to pin the other seam and then I'm going to sew along. Okay, keeping raw edges together and keeping our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, we're just going to start at the bottom hem. And we're going to be careful to go through all these layers at the pocket. I'm coming to the underarm. And then I'm going to do that then on the other side. So we've got the side seams sewn. I've overlocked them. I've pressed the seams to the back using my little shoulder ironing board, which I find so handy. So I've just pressed it there towards the back. And then I have overlocked the hemline. I tried it on and feel that the sleeves are about 4 centimetres too long for me, so I've actually just chopped that off, and I'll adjust the pattern for the next time I make it. So that's all we have to do next, is turn up a 5 centimetre hem here at the bottom. So I'm going to get my little shoulder press again, my sleeve ironing board, sorry. And I am going to turn up 5 centimetres. So it's coming to just about the pocket. And what I'd actually like to do, I think, is I'd like to enclose the bottom of the pocket in the hem if it fits. Because it would just make it stop kind of flapping around. So I was kind of hoping that would work. Okay, so it may or may not. I'd be very tempted to turn up 6 centimetres just to enclose it if yours isn't actually. Mine seems to be working out to be in the hem. I will make sure that it's not actually bulging or sort of bellying out before I sew it. Yeah, it's working out maybe 5.5 centimetres, and I actually think it would be worth enclosing it in it. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this all around. I'm then going to pin up a hem on the sleeve, and this is going to be 4 centimeters. So this is where I find this so handy. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to pin that around. And then what we want to do is we need to sew our hem. We also need to leave a gap so that we can thread our elastic in. So when we're sewing, it's very important to leave about 4 centimeters open. So I'm going to go and keep pinning and meet you at the sewing machine. I'm starting on the hem, and I'm going to start one side of the side seam, so on the back, one side of the side seam. And I am going to keep an eye on my seam allowance. Next up is the cuff. I'm hoping it'll fit through the, it will fit through the free arm. Now I'm going to go one side of the seam, and I'm going to go the side so that if I leave a gap here, I can put my safety pin over the seam, rather than leaving my gap here and then having to try and feel my way through, getting it through the layers here. So on your instructions, there is a chart here with the length of the elastic you need for your size. So I've actually cut 1 meter because I don't want it to be really tight. So either go by your measurement or just pull the elastic around yourself and see what length you think. There appears to be a standard length for the sleeve, which is 45 centimeter. Now, as I said to you, I have the 4 centimeter elastic, and I'm going to trim it in half. And I'm very simply finding the center of it. So I haven't cut 45, I've cut 22. So there's my center. And it's very easy to just cut along the line to trim it in half. There we go. I have my trusty safety pin. I found my gap here in the hem, and I'm just going to put my safety pin through my elastic, and then I'm going to basically thread it through. So because I'm doing it from the back, I'm going to have to get through the layers here, but it's not too bad because it's quite wide. So it's just really a matter of feeding your safety pin through. I've used a medium size one. I could really have put in a bigger one because the boucle is quite thick. So it's just a matter of feeding it through. It's always a case really of once you get through that seam there, you can fly along. So I'm going to keep doing that until the elastic is in. So I've threaded my elastic through. I ended up taking a couple of centimeters off because it was actually too wide, so the length that it states on the pattern is obviously correct for the width. So just pop it back in and I'm going to put a pin here, and I'm going to sew the gap closed. I'm going to make sure that I'm not sewing over the elastic, and then I'm going to even it all out. So I've got a bigger safety pin because I realised that the safety pin I used was just too small really for that gap. And I'm going to do the very same with the cuff ones. So I've left my gap this side of the seam, so it's very easy, just slot it in over the seam because the seams are always the hardest to get the elastic over. I'm going to make sure that I don't end up pulling the elastic through before I get to the end. And then what I'm going to do is sew over that gap, or sorry, sew over that join like so. And then do the same for the hem, push it in and sew over the little gap. So I've got my sleeve hems done, I've got the actual hem all done, and the very last thing we have to do now is to put our snap fasteners through our button placket. Now if you like, you could put buttonholes and buttons. I'm going to take the opportunity to use my Prim Creative tool. So I'm using silver snap fasteners. I've taken out the little attachments that I need to put them in, and I have read the instructions that come with it. The first thing I have to do is I have to punch little holes. So when you get your creative tool, you get a little box of these guys, and they are the piercing tool, so they'll make the little hole. So particularly for these snap fasteners, they definitely need a little hole first. Some of the snap fasteners, particularly the plastic ones, they don't need a hole first. So I've got the little receiver in this part and the little spiky bit up here, and I'm going to line up my mark. So I've used these marks, transferred them onto the button placket. Then I'm going to line that up on top, and then bring that down on top like that and make the little hole. So I've got these to do on both sides, so I'm going to really take my time with this so I get them into the right position. Okay, so as part of the pack of snap fasteners, you get these little tool sets. So we've got two here, and we've got these two. We have the bottom parts, and then we've got the easily recognisable snap from the top. So the most important part to do now is to get your bearings of which goes where. So basically we want the snap on the top, so we want this guy on the top, and we want the little receiver on the bottom, and it's just so easy to make the mistake of putting them in the wrong way. So I think we'll put in the bottom one first. So what we want to do is put this little one on the bottom here, and then we have this one here, and we're going to put it into the top. Now it's a little fiddly. Okay, and we've got this guy, and we're going to put that in here underneath, and I like to put that in here, and that kind of holds everything together, and then put this little guy on top and then it's just a matter of bringing the handle down, quick little squeeze, and it's in. You can do all the rest of them if you like, but I want to show you how to do the top one now. So we take these out, put this on the bottom, we put this one on the top, so we've got a little pointed end there, put that up here, we're going to put this on the bottom here, and then this is the important part, turn this over because we want that on the outside. Just feed it through so you can feel it in the little hole there, and then put this on the top. And then again, squeeze. Now for some reason the little top tool keeps coming out. I think that's just something to do with the way I've attached it in. Just pull it out. I think I need to make an adjustment in the top here. But it's in, and then just very satisfyingly click them together, pull them apart. So we've got another 3 to do.